Sunday Superversive Livestream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and I'm here with Edmund of a YouTube channel of a similar name who has done work on the Cantos. You may notice that my dear friend and co host Anthony Marchetta is not here. Anthony has been deeply studying the Odyssey and has decided that there are hints and clues in the Homeric poetry which will lead him to Poseidon's trident. We all hope Anthony the best success as he seeks to control the waves and to drown all his foes in earth shaking tremors. Edmund, how are you doing today?
Hi, I'm great. And how are you?
I'm doing quite well, thank you, sir. Now, for the audience, the reason why I've wanted to bring you on is sort of as an introduction to poetry. Poetry is one of those written arts that I feel has deeply fallen by the wayside. You can say that certain things like plays are getting an uptick, musicals and stuff like that, they're very popular. Lit had its time in the sun, its prose writing, but quite frankly, poetry has languished. There's been nothing, pardon me, there's been nothing I've wanted to read. There's been nothing I've wanted to interact with. And what I do find is, quite frankly, um, best described as, and charitably described as soulless, and less charitably described as toilet paper. So I'm hoping that you can guide us through how a sensitive young man or any man who's less sensitive, blue collar to white collar, could sort of work through poetry, how to approach it, how to, why read Ezra Pound, I guess I could say, and then we'll start from there.
Yes. Before beginning on this, I will remark on a post I saw the other day on the great Twitter website that essentially someone said not to read anything published after 1945. I do not know the implications of this post and the reasoning on this post. However, I would say that this is generally almost a good way to go. There have been some Ezra Pound things published after 1945, of course, but let's say anyone um, who was middle aged by 1945 is still worth reading. Everything else after that you can discard. It's a very, very aggressive statement. However,
Mm,
it is true what you say. There's a lacking sensation of soul. It's very soulless. I frequent the spoken word events. I'm a traveler. I'm a cosmopolitan bard, let's say. I frequent spoken word events in any city I go to, and it's all pretty much the same thing. It's a very specific type of people who read very specific things, diary entries, as I've been calling them. They, with a Rupi Kaur influence, that godforsaken woman, and
I don't know who that is, but I'll agree with you.
it was a fad some years ago, a Tumblr inspired fad for the youth who spent time on Tumblr as I did. Uh, as far as I know, that's where she grew from. Where and her poetry is very, this free verse stuff. That's she tries to she ends in the. It's always a powerful ending, some kind of powerful romantic ending in the style of I was crying and you didn't give me my napkin and something like that, and all the girls and young boys go, wow, this is very emotional, very, very, very relatable, this kind of stuff. And it's
Taylor
unfortunate that
Swiftian.
yes, and I have no issues with Taylor Swift. She's a hard worker, but this is different. I take issue with her calling herself a poet and using the poet imagery, but that's something else entirely. What I will say is that getting into poetry is quite tough for a person now. I think because there's just such a vast body of work and such a vast body of very, very good work that's meant to be enjoyed with a very specific mindset and a very specific appreciation for life, let's say. And the teaching on it currently is not excellent, i.e., not accessible. There are, of course, many arguments against accessibility, but I don't think now is a time to uh, preach for so-called gatekeeping in terms of getting new students on board, let's say. The other issue is that there's not particularly any good teachers, and I'm hoping to rectify this through my YouTube efforts, at least a little bit. Um, Lost my track of thought there.
Well,
I apologize. Yes, audience, it is very late at night here
oh no,
in the
it's
European
fine.
lands. Yes.
Uh, but like, let's focus on the teacher for a bit. Like, my teachers never really focused on poetry, but there was poetry to read. When I was a child, I did a thing called the Speech and Word Festival in Middle America, which was very fun. You know, you go to like a campground, a very luxurious campground, with air
Yes.
conditioning, and you'd have a whole bunch of different Christian schools, and they would do things. I know one year I memorized, my heart's in the highlands, my heart is not here. My heart's in the highlands, chasing the deer, chasing the wild deer, and following the roe. My heart's in the highlands wherever I go. And then the full poem, which I've lost to the mist of time. Though another year I did a Homeric poem about the labors of Hercules, and this girl with a puppet show beat me. I've never forgiven her. But the excuse me. Uh, but like there was a little self-taught, but really it wasn't directed. No one really could teach me, even though I was interested in writing even then. I remember shows that had poetry in them, and even good poetry. There was one by some quasi beat poet, I guess he was, where he talks about, today is very boring. It's a very boring day. There's an elephant outside my window. And it dives into all this fancy about this guy who's suffering from ennui, even though the world's ending all around him, and, clowns are throwing pies and all this other stuff. So, there was poetry there, at least in my generation, Gen Y, which is, around 89 to 80. Uh, but then one of the things in preparing for this live stream is that there's almost no poetry, except for some modern drivel, in more recent stuff. Like the poem about the guy in the bed was in Arthur, which was the main PBS show post school that all American kids watched if they didn't have cable. So there's definitely, as we've gone past 1945, that's a good year for it. Um, Less and less poetry in the culture, um, to the point where one of the things that started me reading was John C. Wright, was that he had a bit of poetry in the beginning of his science fiction books. Is this the sort of thing you're talking about? Like, there's no teachers, there's no cultural anything to it. Like if somebody's seeking it, they're not going to find it. Is that kind of what you're going at?
I wouldn't say if someone's seeking it, they wouldn't find it, because you can find it, and I found it, and we know other people who have found it and have made great efforts with it. The issue is that, um, first of all, I'd say it's quite difficult to get in touch with people like this. Um, uh, Even though we have the internet and everything, it's still quite difficult. And I've been in some places in the world where it can almost feel a bit embarrassing to say that you enjoy poetry. And another issue I think is very, very, very much education. Now, I cannot answer the question whether poetry should be present in education and in children's education. I come from a place where we were made to memorize many, many by poems by memory, and I did not enjoy this process whatsoever. I enjoyed the poems themselves, but being taught these poems was not very enjoyable. And I can relate a story even, the personal anecdote. I spent I had a teacher who taught Greek poetry, and we did a bit of Homer together, and we did a um, great Greek poet, Kavafis. And she had turned her whole class off from Homer and Kavafis, even though this poetry is just phenomenally good. And it only a couple people that have taken this class with me have reached out to me as we've grown up and entered our 20s, and essentially told me, I have such a sour taste from this individual, but I've actually made the effort to revisit these works and realized how fantastic they are and how badly they were taught to us. So, as I said, it's very difficult to say whether the conclusion to this is that youth shouldn't be taught poetry at all, or that the approach needs to be different, or that the teachers need to be different. This whole education question is, of course, very, very, very broad. But I will
Sure.
say that at least there needs to be a very, 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 very large effort by some individuals to at least try and take up the mantle and not spend all their time in criticism. I people love to critique things and
Hmm.
work, and people love to critique any genuine effort as soon as it takes off, while they themselves don't really do anything. There's a great series of lectures by T.S. Eliot called "The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism," where he says something in I believe in the preface even, uh, essentially that you when you have criticism and you have poetry as um, two distinct arts, let's say, because criticism, of course, is an art too. When you have these two arts, uh, they have an inverse relationship, i.e., when poetry flows very high, you tend to find less good criticism, serious critical works. And when poetry is at a low, you are just flooded with these critical works and critiques and whatever, and endless analysis over and over and over. And this makes me arrive at another point in this, that analysis of poetry that's done on, let's say, an entry level is just not that impressive and not that inspiring. I like to watch videos, of like a basic analysis of a poem, just to see what the person has to say, and it's all just very bland and made for schools, and I'm not sure how you call this in America, but bachelor's degree poetry things,
Oh,
where
we
the
know. Don't
understand
worry about that.
yes. So there, all this, a lot of this material is made for, it has this disgusting school taste. When you start the school, right before you start the school year, you have to go buy your textbooks, and you're in this disgusting room with this horrible hospital lighting, and you're buying these expensive textbooks that are just horrible, horrible. This terrible graphic design, and a lot of these videos that I watch have a very similar feeling to them, and that's just not a serious effort. And
Yes.
and even if someone does take up the mantle, so to speak, and attempt an effort like I am, it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be excellent right off the bat. It just has to be something better than what's being done now. And what's being done now is so low that you can really get away with, at least in the very beginning, there's nothing wrong with getting away with an above average job, let's say, at
Oh, yeah.
trying to impart some teachings on the people around you. And hopefully, just bring people in to the content that you're making, and inspire them to look deeper, like in the way Nietzsche one day, overstepped Schopenhauer, and started critiquing him and saying, that I have so much respect for this person, that he's an opponent worthy of a duel. There's nothing wrong with dueling with the people who maybe brought you to a higher stage, but there's
Oh,
just
I
a lack
agree.
of these teachers, and it's difficult to give one reason why. Another reason could be, I apologize for rambling on and on, but
No, no.
another reason could be that there's just a general lack of craftsmanship. We've sped up in life, and of course a fast life is very enjoyable, but I see very few people who take the time, the proper study necessary to approach craftsmanship, to really reach some kind of mastery level, or even think of themselves as an apprentice and have no
Hmm.
shame in this feeling, and realize that taking they're about to embark on a path that's going to take 10, 15, 20 years, and so maybe they make something that's really good, not in all cases, of course,
No.
but in many cases it's going to take a while to climb that hill, and there's nothing wrong with that, but there's quite a few people who maybe are not too comfortable with facing this fact that they're going to be garbage from the start, and it's very difficult to get it's very difficult to get over your own garbage. I know this feeling profoundly, and I'm not saying that by any manner I'm a good writer, but I can see at least some kind of progress from writing consistently daily
Mm.
and thinking about it and thinking about nothing else. I'm lucky to be in a position to be able to do so as much as I can. But I things that I was very proud of uh, a year ago, I look back on now and say that this is total garbage. And I'm proud to say that this is total garbage because there's a sense of progress there. But it's very there's no instant reward
Mm.
for attempting to dwell in this. I'm talking now from the perspective of a writer. From the perspective of a reader, of course, there is instant reward because you get to read such great works, and the deeper you go, the more you find.
Yes.
And the way to do that is what I recommend to people who message me and have an interest is to just find something that you like and work your way back from there.
Mm.
This is why, as you said, Ezra Pound's cantos were just I had quite a long break from poetry, that I some just wasn't feeling very inspired for a while since I was a teenager, and early university years got in the way and all that kind of stuff, uh, living life outwardly, let's say. And Pound's cantos, really, I accidentally stumbled upon them, and it just blew me away. I read the whole thing in no time. Um, and there's always going to be a work that someone likes that's in this kind of work that they'll just randomly stumble upon and enjoy, and you can just work your way back from there. You see who influenced, or maybe not even backwards, you can work laterally and see who else was active at that time. From Pound you arrive at T.S. Eliot and William Butler Yeats, who are also phenomenal poets, and just with those three individuals you have enough poetry to properly plunge and swim in and enjoy a nice swim,
Mm.
a serious dive.
I agree. Um, T.S. Yeah, and it's like from T.S. Eliot, you're jumping into a very large English tradition, and of course, once you get done with the English tradition, you can go into the Italian tradition. What was his name? Petrarch and Dante.
Dante, yes.
Uh, and then it's like, well, what do you go from? Well, you go to the Romans and then the Homerics. Excuse me. Like there's what you're describing is um, doors opening just through the consumption of it. Even if you struggle to write it yourself, if you want to write it, I do want to just double back really quick on the teacher issue, and I'm actually in agreement with you. I sought out a master very deliberately once I realized I was no longer an apprentice and I needed a pre-apprentice, I guess you'd say. And I needed a master who could, talk to me about the craft, because the craft comes from us, but at the same time, somebody has to talk to you about it, and you have to respect them. And I found that once I took a master, and dragged him kicking and screaming into it. No, I'm kidding. It smoothed out some of my ideas. I was mimicking his style already, but now I'm truly mimicking him, and I'm truly seeking out my own voice, because there's a reason why God put the master and the student together. Um, there's more to that relationship than some sort of, how do I want to put it, some sort of title. Um, if you don't have a master, who can you respect to tell you whether you're good or not, or whether you're worthwhile or not, or whether your head's on straight, that you can respect? Some, cat lady coming up to me, I watched Pinkerton's Ghost and you're way too violent. Ma'am, the point of the violence is to show God's divine wrath upon the werewolf, who has abandoned his God given human form to kill children and devour, women and stuff. oh well, it's too violent. It's like, no, you know, like, what am I supposed to do with that? Well, I just say no. The master, you know, says it's fine. Um, you know, I don't know how it would work for poetry. Uh, does he beat you whenever your syllables are out of sync? I could not say. Um, it's
Well, you're you know, poet. We're very lucky today that you. Of course, it would be much better to have a physical mentor and master, but you can seek this mentor relationship with the poets of the past, which is a fantastic and lucky, fortunate thing that we find for ourselves in a world that's not too fortunate right now. You I myself am a proponent of just raw output and doing and doing and doing and doing and reading as much as you can and mimicking whatever you find even slightly entertaining
no
or
argument.
pleasureful to you, let's say. And eventually your own voice will come out. If you're a person of ability or and of any talent whatsoever, eventually you will steer it in your own direction. Just what's required is a massive amount of work, and a massive amount of work. I think that's not not conventionally rewarding. Let's say, of course, we don't care about conventional success, but there's still that factor, unavoidable factor of being beaten down by conventional needs and requirements. You can no longer live in someone's attic. It's you will be paying rent four and a half
No,
thousand dollars in New York City. This
no.
kind of stuff. um, so we are indeed very lucky that all these great works are available. We live in a time where absolutely anything. I went to a museum today and I picked up a book by a French poet, a comic poet, but nevertheless he writes well sometimes. Guillaume Apollinaire, and this was a very cheap purchase. I was very happy about this, and this is something that this is a book that would have been unavailable to many people, even 150 years ago, let's say, unless you had a decent amount of wealth or something like that. So
Or
that's a great thing.
connections, or, you
Yeah,
know.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So we are unlucky in the fact that if you find yourself as a creative individual, you walk a very currently it's a very empty, desolate wasteland. Let's say, as T.S. Eliot wrote, it's a wasteland, and it can be quite lonely. But maybe you take pleasure in this. You're founding a new frontier or something. This is another thing that uh, very very important not to overdwell on the past. Let's say you have to, at the end of the day, if you feel this
Yes.
drive at least even a little bit, you need to point it forward and hopefully make something new and something fresh. And this is I believe a person like this will arrive soon in the poetic world. It's hard to say when and who and how,
Hmm.
but I foresee at least one more surge forward into something new, at least a new kind of spirit, because the poet is, in some ways, the let's say the one who crafts the morals and the sense of virtues around him.
Yes.
The issue, once again, going back to modern poetry, is that there is no there is nothing to gain from it except this kind of self jerking off of sensations and these endless climaxes of relatability, let's say. So yes, as you said, you arrive at different traditions by starting from works that you enjoy, and
Hmm.
then you go back and you arrive at all sorts of traditions. Even if you only speak English, if you don't speak any other language, you already have such a profoundly deep body of poetry that you can study, and there's just so much poetry to read. It's so
Yes.
easily available. All you have to do is just honestly, you can Google it. You don't even need the physical. I like to buy physical books, of
Oh,
course,
me
but
too. Yeah.
If you can't afford that, then that's not an issue
I,
either. There's so much available. What's really needed
mm,
is to have the strength and the patience to sit down, because of course you're reading for enjoyment, and you want to enjoy yourself. You also want to find some kind of truth or something that speaks to you, but it can still be a difficult, if you take it very seriously. It can be a very difficult, it can be quite difficult at times. Every man has a innate need to just sit down and lounge about, and proper good reading is not always leisurely. It can be a rigorous study, which is quite tough at times.
oh, I agree with you in that. Even though like certain science fictions seem to be very airy and easy to read, or certain horrors and stuff like that, it's very difficult to get the mood and the setting right. It's beyond some sort of Matrix. Everyone in black trench coats, jumping off of buildings, dual wielding pistols or something. It's something more that you have to tease out. Much like the meaning of a poem, or the lyrics of a song. I do say, I know I'm circling back to something you already talked about, and we shouldn't retread too much. But I do believe that the climate is right for these great men of culture to rise up. I myself have been plagued by dreams of them, but also I've been seeing it in things like sculpture. Finn de Villiers has done great work, and he
Yes,
started
yes,
to.
he's a very, very, very impressive artist. I follow
Oh
his
yeah,
work closely.
same here. Same here. Just because it's like he's doing great stuff, and like it's inspiring to me, and it's like, wait a minute, But in reality, what is he doing? He's just providing a very good product. He's being a very good artist. He's well spoken and looks good on film. But it's like, I could do that. Anyone could do that. And it's time to strive for it. It's our enemies have trampled on our faces too long. Rise up, ye oh, wait a minute, no, 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 bad. Um, but no, like there's, I think the fertilizer is very ripe, is very ready for what comes to the future. Because I've noticed, and this is comes from spiritual reflections more than art reflections. But a great deal has been trampled on and retarded by things like the baby boomers keeping power over, say, churches. And I've noticed, through working with or observing the work of Vox Day and others, is that it's the same spirit in charge of our publishing houses, of our the things that would welcome artists, avant-garde or otherwise, into their ranks after a certain point. Like, T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, were mentioned, by popular culture like Arthur, which was reading focused, of course, inside inside a show that's meant for kids, and liberal kids at that. So there's cultural power that's been lost, and I do think it comes again. Though I must keep down my revolutionary fervor. It is unbecoming on an Anglo.
Well, another thing to say about Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot is that they were also uh, very, very interesting men, very culturally rich men. But on top of that, probably the most important marker for me is that they were excellent at what they were doing. They were absolutely excellent. It was undeniable that they were, the voices of their generations, the definers of that period. I wouldn't, I don't like using the word unmatched, so I will not say this, but they were
Mm.
at the top. And I don't really see anything like that today. Once
Well,
again.
I've been studying Andy Warhol, and I've been studying beginning to study, I should say, very surface level. It's half the reason why I have you on. T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, especially Ezra Pound, and it's clear that those two were sharpening each other. they were making each other great even as they were producing great work. What do you think so?
Yes, of course. There's a very fascinating manuscript of T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, which he sent to Ezra Pound for editing, and you can actually see all his marginalia and all this kind of stuff, all the annotations he made, everything he crossed out, and he was very ruthless in his approach. There is actually. The Wasteland begins with April is the cruelest month, but there is actually an entire page of verse missing that T.S. Eliot intended to open the poem with, that is just crossed out with this, these aggressive pen marks, almost scratching through the paper. So they were very very ruthless with each other in how they managed their work. But there was, of course, a lot of love there. There's they have the Wasteland is dedicated to Ezra Pound, after all. Um, this is the importance of having a literary circle around you and trying to build a circle of people who take these things very seriously and are willing to tell you the truth, where the goal is not to achieve some kind of fame together, but just uh, really really fine tune each other's art and give genuine constructive criticism that does not, let's say,
Yes.
not to sound too soft, but does not offend the person or discourage the person who's trying to work. I'm not, of course, I'm not advocating for blank statements of "you're so great" and "you're so good," but there still needs to be an understanding between people that it's art after all, and you have to be somewhat sensitive sometimes with some people. But the point being is that yes, they did indeed help each other very very much. You would not have one without the other, I believe. Um, it's difficult to say in whose direction the weights were balanced. I don't really have a firm opinion on that, but they were very very important to each other. This is
Hmm.
true, and these kinds of relationships are extremely important, and you should nurture them if you're a creative individual.
I completely agree. Though I do believe, just from my own experience with these things, even outside art, that it's as much as one as the other. Like even if it were less than what it was, it would be less than what it is, and if it were more than what it was, it wouldn't be what it is today. Something like that.
Yes,
It's
yes,
yeah, like the balance was. Foreordained. Being a religious man, I tend to see
yes,
these things. So it's like I do believe that the province of art is under the hand of God, and we are inspired. The muses serve the Holy Spirit, if you get me.
yes,
Um, not to pontificate. I am a pastor's son, but I do believe that these things. That there is a force of will in them. I think part of the reason why Finn de Villiers finds his success in even for public, um, whatever is because there's almost nothing being done in sculpture that's worth looking at. So it's very it's very
yes,
easy for his very
yes.
attractive futurism, to shine through, whereas we must struggle some more. So let's focus on T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound for a minute. Let's say, that I'm wandering through a bookstore and I see a book for that. How would you had a natural spark of poetry, of course, but for someone who is more leaden in his readings patterns, how would you recommend somebody go about that, or maybe as a gift for somebody else? Let's say it's a gift for somebody else. What would you say for an ideal?
What I would say is, first of all, it's important to remember that these works are, in some ways, pinnacles of long traditions and the breaking of rules in long traditions. So, if it's different if it's a gift, and I will get to that a bit later. But if you're buying for yourself and you just want to read some of this work, I would avoid Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, at least a little bit avoid them, because their work can be very tough, difficult to understand, especially Ezra Pound's cantos. That's a very, very difficult work that needs guides in order for you to really understand. It can be,
Sure.
it can really, it can turn a person off just from how, from you know, I don't like the word convoluted, but complicated. Let's say it's complicated. It requires a vast amount of reading to understand what he's really getting at. So, if you're making a gift, it is much simpler. If it's a gift for a person who is just, you know, has a passing interest and just has mentioned that they like to read such things, I would actually recommend a very specific book in for Ezra Pound. It's published by Faber and Faber. It's this very pretty, quite cute, 180-ish page book called Ezra Pound Selected Poems 1908-1969. It has a great selection of the essentials of Ezra Pound. It features some of his cantos. It features some excerpts of his cantos as well, not the full things, but the most, let's say, interesting parts of certain cantos, the later cantos especially, that get a lot more complicated. It has earlier poems. It just has a bit of everything. It's the, let's say, the quintessential Pound, the best of Pound. Let's say it's very good. Once again, Faber and Faber. It's this
Ah.
orange book. It's I've seen it in every single store I've been to recently. They always have a couple copies. Even stores that don't have anything else by him usually will have a copy or two of this book. For T.S. Eliot, I believe there is a similar. There's also a Faber and Faber edition that's blue. It's a blue book. It looks exactly the same. It's just T.S. Eliot's work. You can buy something like that. Generally speaking, there's nothing wrong with buying these, you know, collected works that Oxford World Classics puts out as well. You know, with these quite nice covers. This white with red text on it, and usually some kind of image. These kinds of works are fantastic. There's a very nice one by Oxford World Classics for Yeats, which features a bit of his some of his essays as well, some of his poetry spanning his entire life. These things are great because you can read, you know, chronologically through how the poet progressed, or you can just find find a poem that maybe you've heard of before or that you like, that you're already familiar with, and just read around the page. Or usually there's selections, a bit of everything from each book that the author released. So you usually, you know, you can place that poem into a better context of what book it came in, and then maybe find the whole book later on at some point. So you don't need to get too specific with it. Most of my poetry books are just these sorts of collections. Now, of course, I've been really buying individual books a lot because I want to see the work in itself, but how it was intended to be read by the author. But there's, once again, nothing wrong with buying these, you know, basic looking collections, let's say, for a gift or for yourself as well.
Oh, I got you. I got
You
you.
can you can start like that, and then just, you know, return to the bookshop again and see what else they have by the author, and buy some more and read. This is very basic advice, but it really, it boils down to that. You don't need to overcomplicate it. But just the only thing I would say is that diving into some of these, you know, modernist art authors of the first of the previous century, they can be difficult. I usually recommend people to start with William Butler Yeats, because he is one of my favorite authors, poets. He still, you know, he still respects form, whereas T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound do not, in varying degrees. In T.S. Eliot, you find that you feel more of a sense that there is some underlying form there that he's you know, bending and breaking the rules of for his achieved effects. Whereas with Ezra Pound, the later you get into his work, you see almost this complete dissolution of form in favor of melodicity, which is something he speaks about in a great book of his, The ABC of Reading, which itself can also be quite a tough read, even though it's an ABC, within which he says poetry, you know, poetry degenerates as it moves away from music. Uh,
I
and
got you.
which it is quite interesting, as even though he had said that he himself um, moved away from what people usually think is the musicality of a poem, which is, you know, the form and the syllabic count and all that kind of stuff. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that, because by reading Ezra Pound's cantos, especially the later ones, um, you see that there's great melody there, even though the form is broken. It's free verse. Um, but yes, the cantos I would avoid for some, unless you really want to read them. But I can guarantee any reader who takes up the cantos will be very confused and perhaps even discouraged. You can the best way, as I said to begin, is to just find the poet that you already like and see their works in whatever language you can read. You can I would recommend Russian authors. Of course, not many in the audience will know the language. But there's a very fortunate piece of information, which is that Russian poetry translates very well into French. So if you're a French speaker, excuse me, if you're a French speaker, you can enjoy Russian poetry quite well, and not a lot of it, but there are some significant poets that do at times read better in French than in Russian. They I don't know, kind of unlock a different sensibility with
Hmm.
with the French language. All that is to say that approaching these major works that people say you should read, you know, the Divine Comedy by Dante, it's a long work, and I'm sure there's people who, you know, read a bit of it and they just can't power through it for now, and they um, maybe feel discouraged or a bit ashamed that they didn't finish the book and they put it aside for later or maybe for never. This is why it's not always, you see these endless posts online about these great books, all this and all that and all this, but some are not as great as people say, uh, especially, you know, for just for literature. I have a bit of an issue with Dostoevsky that I don't want to get into too much, but he overrated is a dirty word. I don't want to use this word. It's not a pretty word, but
Right.
he is praised for some things that are not praiseworthy, let's say, and can be a bit confusing to the modern reader. But just anything that you ever enjoyed can be read. I do have a list of recommendations that I'll give a bit later. I will read through it in a bit of a monologue a bit later, of some things that I would recommend that I thoroughly enjoy in the
Shoot
English
away.
language. Yeah, well, I'll circle back to that a little when we're closing out.
Yeah, I do. Have so. I know Dante's Inferno, the Divine Comedy, does show up sometime. Famously, Wendigoon did a whole shtick on it that received, you know, a million something views or more. You know, there's plenty of cultural talk about Dante's Inferno and similar epic poems like that. How does one sift the story from, so let's say I watch a video about the Divine Comedy, then I read the Divine Comedy. How would you say someone could separate the video they watched, you know, with the experience of the poem itself? Sort of get into the flow of it without getting distracted.
You would essentially have to practice some mindful amnesia, let's say. The purpose the Hopefully the purpose of a video such as this would be not to just nudge you along to read such a thing. I am generally not a fan of videos that are a preface to some kind of reading, which is funny enough, because my channel, my efforts so far have been sort of, uh, about some poems, but I'm with my audience, I'm making the assumption that people will at least have read the poem, perhaps, or if they haven't, this is why in every video I include a reading segment where the poem is read either by myself or by the original author.
I
if we're lucky
appreciate
enough to
those.
have a recording. My upcoming video, which I will not spoil for now, it's incredibly long. My videos usually are half an hour, but this one is looking to be at least 2.5 hours, if not more. There's about approximately a 20-minute reading by the author off the poem before we look at it line by line and say some interesting things. So at least there will be this one-time experience of hearing it, even if you didn't make the effort. Because we have to admit that many people will not. It's likely that some people will not make the effort, and they will just watch a YouTube video. Not that there's anything wrong with that per se. It's people's comfort after all, or whatever. um,
Right, right.
but generally, I avoid videos about any kind of literature before. I would avoid this. I would recommend avoiding any kind of videos about literature that you have not read yourself. Um, there there is very little to gain except some kind of bias that or an idea that the person making the video has put into your head from beforehand. You should just read the book. If you've heard about a book, just take the time to read the book and then do your research. Even if you even feel a need to do so, perhaps you will read it and find it so, you know, self-contained, so to speak, that you won't feel a need to watch any kind of video. The more familiar usually you get with the work, the less you feel a need to kind of consume any kind of introductory things about it.
That does make sense. Thank you.
Yes, I have made some notes beforehand. Let me see if there's anything that I wanted to mention specifically. Yes, generally speaking, it is a great help to. It is of great help to know a second or third language, or at least be in the process of learning a language. Poetry is not just about the meaning of the words on the paper, but about the words themselves and obviously how they sound together. There's a lot of meticulous work that goes into that. I just earlier today I saw an image of Baudelaire's Flowers of Evil, Les Fleurs du Mal, which had his own notes on the manuscript, and just the amount of little sounds he changes in the ending of a word, or just rewriting a single word, even if he loses the meaning, to objectively sound better when you read out loud, which is a great segue into reading out loud itself. Is something that I encourage everyone to do if you're into poetry or want to enjoy poetry. There's it can be quite silly at times, reading out loud to yourself, but you should do it. You should memorize poems as well. Memorizing poems is a great thing, and perform them as well as you can to yourself in the mirror or without. Take pride in your voice and find that voice and find that pronunciation. It'll be very good for your articulation in general in life. But there's a lot of, for example, the great French poet Stéphane Mallarmé. There's quite a lot to be unlocked once you read his poetry out loud. There are things that you will only. This is why it's so difficult to translate him into English, and why a lot of his work remains untranslated, or at least untranslated in a good way. Let's say translated badly. Let's say there are things, there are audio qualities that you will only get if you read those poems out loud. And he had this infamous Le Mardi chez Mallarmé, these gatherings at his house, these weekly gatherings of poets who would just sit in his living room, and he would give a little talk about a poem, or about some poetry, or read a poem, and then they would discuss and give these individual lectures to each other, a group discussion about the
Right,
work. And
right.
this was a very, very, very exclusive circle of poets that did very great things with their art. and the great German poet Stefan George was invited into this circle, and he became just a marvel of German poetry in the previous century. Um, so learning languages, or if you speak any other language, any language except your native tongue, can also be extremely beneficial, and it's a good way to practice that as well. It's all these bilingual editions that exist. You can you will realize that your language has gotten to a good enough point when you see mistakes in the translation. My I have quite a few bilingual copies of various French authors, and uh, my I taught French to myself on my own, and I what began as a great assistance, let's say, these translations ended up being this realization that these translations are quite bad, and being able to find those mistakes is very rewarding, and maybe fix them, and give it your own try. So language in itself is an art, and a beautiful thing to hear. Select languages, of course, not every language that exists in the world, but this is perhaps too impolite to say.
No, I agree with you, and I'm actually teaching myself French, so I can. My intention was to read Maupassant and Flaubert in their original language, and perhaps Victor Hugo. But it seems I'll have to also read poetry as well.
Yes, you should absolutely. French poetry is it's purely fantastic. It's really it's a pleasure to read, and a completely different sensual experience, let's say. And I started learning French because I wanted to read Louis Ferdinand Céline, great novelist of the previous century. Perhaps his book Journey to the End of the Night.
Yes, I've heard of
Uh,
it.
yes, he's in English. It is in reading his works in English is uh, very entertaining, and very nice, very great works. But in French, it just it unlocks this new level of the ability he had, and the language he used, very raw, and a very vulgar language that actually it becomes pleasant. It becomes quite pleasant. You take some joy in the language of the working underclass man, let's say. um, yes.
I get you. Uh, yeah, because it's thinking back on some of the poems I've read. Um, with the heart, my heart's in the Highlands poem. I almost find myself sort of like giving myself the rough edge of a Scottish brogue or something. To make it sound more in tune with what the author may have intended. And with some English poems I've read, there is a definite to some melody to the best. And when I've heard famously Bronze Age pervert quoted some of the Iliad in ancient Greek, there was certainly a rhythm to Homer's work in the original language it was written in. That uh, it, hmm, like
It's lost in translation. Yes, it's
yes, that's a good way to put it.
on the point of Homer. The thing to keep in mind is that the English poets who translated them into English, there is a rhythm, as you said, to every language, and to the poetry of that language. Hence, you have the Japanese haiku, for example, which doesn't work that well in English unless you make some syllabic changes, and even then, I don't think it's an imported success, let's say. But
You're right.
with Homer, for example, when he was translated into English, he was translated into English poetry, and the rhythm was changed into standard English rhythm, which is iambic pentameter. What Shakespeare wrote in. This was if I recall correctly, this is a fascinating point about Shakespeare's the iambic pentameter in general is that it's the from perhaps this is incorrect. I'm not sure. I just heard it somewhere, but that it's a perfect amount of speaking time for an actor on stage. This classic English line of 10 syllables, um, with a certain rhythm. And you in other languages, because of the speed of the language and how it's constructed, you have different syllabic counts. And in Russian poetry, for example, you will find the 12-syllable line a lot more than you will find in English, because some words, Russian words, tend to be a bit longer. Um, so this is why, if you want to read Homer, I would recommend reading Richmond Lattimore's translation, because he stays true to the syllabic count, to the hexameter. And he's a great translator. He has quite a big body of work under his belt. He was born in China, so there must have been some. He's an American born in China, so must have been some interesting Eastern influence there, of some, I don't know, some spiritual influence from the East coming
Certainly.
into his work. But he achieved a great output of translations, and he sticks close to Homer's intended meter, and the rhythm is not in any way the rhythm is not similar to an ancient Greek reading, a rendition of Homer, but there is still a sense of rhythm that's closer to what you would expect from the original work, because and there's none of this Emily Wilson style additions that don't make sense, and the perversions, let's say, of the original text, because he is constrained by the line by line translation that he's doing. So he really does not stray too much or add or remove that much, and just translates it as well as he can. And it's
Right.
maybe it's maybe not as beautiful as Chapman's Homer, as Keats told us. The beauty of Chapman's Homer, but it's still makes for very, very pleasant and very easy reading. So if you're unfamiliar with the Iliad, then I would recommend the viewer to pick up a copy by Richmond Lattimore. It's very readily available on Amazon and the likes. And I believe he has a translation of the Odyssey as well. I'm 90% certain that he does.
I get you. That's hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. I don't really have anything to add with it. It's just like with the rhythms, it feels like people chose to seek the rhythms, um the sounds, and then you get some strange person screaming at an art festival and then saying thank you, I'll be here all week. um so thinking about it, it's like it's something to ponder, it's something to consider, because as a prose writer, I do have to consider the sound of the words, but I'm not writing poetry. Even though the sounds are very important, the thought behind it is also very important, because if the thought stops, as I would say with a poem, maybe the sensuousness of the poem stops. If the poem is trying to be sensual, then why are you reading it? The spell is broken. You will fritter on your merry way and never think of this again.
Yes, well, interruptions in meter in general are quite. They're very unpleasant once you become fine-tuned to, the, let's say, when you study form enough, and you can identify it just from a glance. There's many there's a great courage required of some young poet to come and say, there's a lot of works that have serious mistakes. Ezra Pound did this in the previous century. He called out, if I remember correctly, it was Lord Byron, and he said, his work is great, but it's hard to find a passage where there isn't some serious error in his form. And this is the difficulty of poetry, isn't it? To balance form and also balance the central aspect of not losing the weight that you're carrying of emotion or senses or glory or whatever it is that you're praising in your little this nugget of beauty that you get, since poetry, after all, is not only the veneration of great things and the inspiration of things and the shaping of people's thought around you, but also poetry is a respite from the ugliness of the world, the utter not always ugly, but heavy ugliness at times. You find pleasure in these beautiful little fragments.
Absolutely, absolutely. Uh, you said you had a list. We've been going an hour. How are you feeling?
Yes, I'm good. I can go through the list. I'll monologue through it a little bit. It's not a very long list. It's just some things that I enjoyed myself, some things that I can recommend.
I I'll just before that I'll just answer a question for the audience. You know, Cats the musical.
I have heard of it. I have not viewed it.
Neither have I. The musical loving co-pilot of this live stream wants to know if T.S. Eliot what he would have thought of Cats, because famously it's based on T.S. Eliot's poem, Cats, and the various
Yes, yes.
characters he describes. So, would he be foaming at the mouth? Would he have loved it?
I,
What's your
I, I,
thoughts?
un- I unfortunately cannot say because I have not seen the Cats musical, and I also have to admit a huge blunder on my part is that I've somewhat avoided T.S. Eliot's cat-related poetry and have put it aside for now for a later time. Um, it is a bit too amusing for my for my tastes.
I get you.
So I can return with an answer for that in some later time when I take the dive into the great Cats musical production. But to just to get to this list, as we've already mentioned, of course, Pound and T.S. Eliot. If you want to see free verse, I will also make a very controversial suggestion, based off a story of a friend who his first array into poetry was Charles Bukowski. And my own personal relationship with Charles Bukowski is quite rocky, for uh, he is a bad writer from the technical side of things. He is, one of these people who popularized ending your poem with a single word, or writing this entire, almost entirely vertical poem where the line breaks don't make sense. But he's a quite indicative case of, I think, what's going on generally is that he does have an instinct, and he does have the feeling, and he does have the depth of feeling, which some people who write just do not. We have to face the fact that some people like the depth of feeling, and he has it, but he does not know how to put it into paper. And there's a recording of him saying once that he walked into a library many, many times, and he's checked out Ezra Pound's cantos, and he just, I think he says he couldn't get through the damn thing or something like that. And it's indicative of something that's very, very. It's a big shame that such people with a depth of feeling could not. Uh, Perhaps his life did not allow him to sit down and actually really study what he's doing and make something of himself. So if the for the layman, let's say, Charles Bukowski is also something that you could approach, very easy reading, just for a sample, but it's something that you should not dwell on for too long, I would say. But
Sure.
to return to this list with free verse, I would just recommend T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, as I mentioned, those Faber and Faber books. And for modernist poetry that still adheres to form, is obviously William Butler Yeats. He's, as I mentioned earlier, he's one of my favorite poets. He just does fantastic things with form. He's a master of form, in my opinion. And then once you do get into form, you can, for example, begin with someone like a Byron or Alfred Lord Tennyson as well. His Idols of the King, specifically the Death of Arthur poem, Mort d'Arthur. Fantastic poem. Very, very. If you're at all familiar with the tales of King Arthur, this is something that would be very, very enjoyable for you. Um, and then what I enjoyed personally, and I've actually been posting on my Twitter the past few days, is the 18th century poet James Thomson, who has two really big redeeming works. One is, in my opinion, very difficult. His Seasons. It's very difficult and long. And then you have a work that's much easier to read and enjoy. A very beautiful work called The Castle of Indolence, from I believe 1748, if I remember correctly, maybe 49. And it's written in Spenserian stanzas. Very specific kind of form. Very easy to read. Very, very nice to read. And then there's another James Thomson who was a century later, but he wrote under a pseudonym, Bish Vanolis. And I would recommend, there's a great collection of his work called A Voice from the Nile and Other Poems. This is something that I would recommend reading as well. It's something to get inspired by, let's say. And then, of course, you have Dante in my list here, the Longfellow translation specifically. And then you can go with Keats, of course, Shelley, I believe I mentioned already. If you want something more challenging, a personal favorite of mine is Robert Browning's Sordello. It's I believe I mentioned it in the Ezra Pound video. It's a great point of inspiration for Ezra Pound himself. It's a very long poem that was critiqued for being too obscure, and it was really greatly misunderstood during Robert Browning's time in the 19th century. And what's interesting is that his wife, I can never find any of his books in bookshops. Only his wife, who was also a poet, Elizabeth Barrett. Sorry. I've never read any of her work, but she's littering all the bookshops while Robert Browning remains in obscurity. His Sordello is a retelling of a troubadour life, of a troubadour called Sordello in the English, which gets me onto another point related to learning languages. There's a great language called the Provençal, the Southern French tongue of 1,000 years ago, which is the Occitan tongue. It's I believe it's an endangered language at this point, so it's there's risk of extinction. But it's a very poetic language. It was Ezra Pound. It was one of Ezra Pound's favorite languages as well, and it's the poetry written in this language is just phenomenal. These were the people who were responsible for bringing form to us as we know it. Really focusing on rhyme and the syllabic count and all that kind of stuff. It's all attributed to these wandering bards and the bards who stayed in courts and sang great, beautiful music in this kind of half Spanish, half French tongue, let's say. To that list, in addition, is a sequence of sonnets called "The House of Life" by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, pardon my pronunciation. Very, very well crafted sonnets, many of them, a long sequence of them on the various. There's kind of two halves to the book. One is more of a love sonnets to a certain lady, certain fine lady, and then there's another half that's more of a kind of, let's say, aesthetic experience. I don't know how else to state it. And
I
these
gotcha.
are all, yes, these are all English works, so this is fully accessible for the English reader. And then if you're an Italian reader, obviously you can read Dante in the original.
Hmm.
If you want to give it a go, you can read Chaucer
Right.
in the Middle English, which can be tough, but you if you read the words out loud slowly, you'll realize that the language actually makes a lot of sense. It's
Oh yeah.
very, yeah, quite easy to understand at that point.
Once you realize what they're doing with the letter F, it actually smooths out quite a bit of the
Yeah.
weird spelling. I do want to say, you mentioned Rossetti. He was one of the pre-Raphaelites, and I'm very fond of his wife's work in Goblin Market, uh, which I don't know if you've read.
I have not actually.
It's very interesting, melancholic works. I'm
Hmm.
fairly melancholic myself, so they kind of speak to me in a way, and I'm very fond of them.
Yes, I'm not a very melancholic man, nor am I too interested in the romantic experience, let's say. So, there's a, even in the House of Life work that I mentioned by him, I I tend to not pay too much attention to the love sonnets, and or unfortunately, I cannot find myself. I cannot find too much interest for the love or the melancholic subject, which is, I'm a great enjoyer of Russian poetry, but a lot of it is very melancholic and very nostalgic and homesick, and I have to discard this, unfortunately.
Oh,
These are feelings that weigh us down, and we have to move forward and up.
it's true.
Which is why, of course, I recommend, also Homer, of course, and ancient Greek poets. I'm very fond of the work of Theognis. He's a certain man from Megara a long time ago. He was an elegiac poet. His form is quite interesting. Uh, his work is very, very nice as well. More of a kind of, not even he was, he was mislabeled as a person who gives life's teachings, but then eventually Nietzsche actually did a great job and said in his dissertation that this was an individual who just experienced life and wrote about it. He wasn't trying to impart any kinds of teachings on, he wasn't one of these virtue virtue individuals. He wasn't one of these morality teachers. Let's say he had a student, a friend whom that was the only person he really wanted to teach about life and his thoughts, and he wrote them down in these beautiful little excerpts that don't really read like poetry, but still it is considered poetry if you read it in the ancient Greek.
I gotcha. Perhaps it's the Anglo in me loving Anglo poetry. I was almost thrown out of my chair when you said you must thrust away the romantic parts. I guess well, not romantic, depressive maybe, homesick. You said parts of Russian poetry. I thought that was the whole point, sir.
Yes, yes, it's a beautiful feature. It is an absolutely beautiful feature, but I set sights to the future. There's
Sure.
I don't like longing in the past or dwelling in the past or in these kinds of feelings. To each his own, of course.
Oh yeah, yeah.
If you're a young man who's met by maybe love that has not been returned, then there is no issue in finding comfort in poetry that talks about this. But I am, my sights are set to something different. Let's say I'm interested in just the art itself and the work itself. I don't maybe this is a sin, but I don't read poetry as much for the meaning as for just what they do with the languages itself themselves, what they're able to achieve, and what's great about it and what's life affirming about it. Let's say what's positive about it.
Oh, I agree with you. There has been poetry I've read. Not that I've read very much. That I've said, oh, this is just dry and dusty old bones, and I've set it aside and then picked up something like Arabian poetry, which is very much full of fire and ancient wisdom
Yeah.
and
Yes.
more. And I would say that I've probably read more Arabic poetry accepting English poetry. Have you any opinion on that?
I am completely unfamiliar with the genre. Absolutely unfamiliar. I have not dwelt outside of Europe for. I mean, the European continent, including the UK, of course,
Yes.
including and the the old European man, the young European man, perhaps the American. Um, I have not dwelt far from there yet. Uh,
Hmm.
there's too much to work with already.
Yeah, it's true, and I think we're drawn to what we like. But with so with these guys, we've talked about. Uh, Let me see here where we can start. Your recommendations. Uh, we even though we haven't like talked about different ways to enjoy poetry, we have talked about different styles. I think if we were to compare, our tastes, I enjoy more some sort of sensual, emotional thing. A poem about a woman looking out to sea. As much as I do enjoy the Iliad, don't get me wrong.
Yes.
Um, I enjoy one and the other, though I admittedly have a bit more love for Beowulf ripping the arm from Grendel. Uh,
Yes. Yes.
but you seem to be a bit more, how should I put it, involved in the craft of it. Like the pleasure of the thing is as much in its well made construction as it is in the thing itself. Would you say that's
Yes. 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 And in my case, maybe the construction is the pleasure of the construction may perhaps be even higher than the pleasure of the thing itself. Um, I don't really know if that indicates something positive, something negative. I don't have an opinion on that. It's just a plain truth that
it's
I
neutral?
I
Yeah,
value. Yeah, it's a neutral truth that I admire the construction much more because I understand what goes into it. I've tried and I really understand the amount of effort that has to be made, the amount of care. I really just I adore spending time finding all these kinds of manuscripts, as I mentioned earlier, the Wasteland one and the Baudelaire's one, uh, with these notes, and reading through these notes and seeing the opinions of the author himself on his work and what has to be changed and why it was changed, and trying to find a reason for why this change was made. This is truly the addictive process for me, more so than the enjoyment of the final product, let's say, and the meaning behind the final product, let's say.
oh yeah,
Not to say, of course, that it's not important to me. Otherwise, otherwise I'd just be reading, graphs of construction. But there's a there's just a great pleasure in seeing it all come together and understanding how much effort was put into it, and that's why it's so almost insulting to see poetry today and how little how little. I saw a video some time ago of someone on some social media platform. I don't remember which one. Some guy who uh, recorded himself writing a poem, and he was just going on and on for pages and pages and pages and pages. And I was thinking, maybe this is some kind of we found a new voice for a generation, the way he's able to just churn out work, and he's going and he's going. And it was time lapsed as well, so it was a decent, couple hours of him just flipping pages in his notebook. Almost he it was a brand new notebook, and he filled almost the full thing. And then he posted everything that he wrote in there, and it was just diary entries. It was just all this kind of stuff, like, Father, you beat me one too many times, and now I hate you. And this is poem one. And then and then poem two is like, my mother didn't give me attention, and now I don't give attention to her. And it's like, well, this is supposed to reverberate with the abandoned child or whatever, which segues me onto another topic. I've been spending some time, and unfortunately some money on this as well, buying prize winners. For example, the T.S. Eliot Prize. The T.S. Eliot Prize was awarded to I can't recall the name exactly of this individual. He's from the African continent. He was awarded a prize for this book of poems, and the T.S. Eliot Prize. It's a prestigious name, of course, prestigious reward. And I went and picked up the book, and I read through it, and it was pretty much this what I just described. It was just there was no form, there was nothing
Okay.
interesting in it whatsoever. It was. Uh, these the story is that his father was not nice to him, and in their in the, in the African culture of the oppressive father and the authoritarian mother, or the no, I apologize, not the oppressive father, the what's the word here, the the
That
father who
they're
abandons,
oh
the father who
yes,
abandons
yes.
his child. Yes, a father who abandons his child, and the authoritarian mother, and how this relates to dating and self-image and sexuality and all this kind of, I don't know who reads these things. I mean, I obviously read this thing, but I don't think I don't think the primary audience is just men like myself who pick up this book in order to critique it. I'm assuming it has genuine enjoyers, which I do not really understand how you can enjoy that. But I'm actually planning to eventually make a annual review of these kinds of prizes. I've picked out a couple of the major prizes that are handed out for poetry, and I'll make some videos reading through them and giving my thoughts, and perhaps I'll find a thing or two that's respectable.
Hmm. That's a good segue to something I've been thinking about. Prizes and awards, and receiving the olive leaf for this or that. Um, what it seems that there is something lost by not having any rewards, but at the same time, it's very clear that they are a prime target for corruption, and it feels very odd for me because it's like it does something that its lack is made less of without them. But anytime they're created, you can set a watch that within 50 years it'll be worthless.
Yes, this is a very. I honestly do not know how to address such an issue. It's you need people in the committees in the foundations that give out these prizes. You need to have sensible people that enter and work in these places. Will they be accepted to work in such a place? Who knows? I'm a firm believer that if you're excellent enough, you'll open any door. So maybe
It's
if
true.
people take up this craft and are slowly inspired and really put in the time and decide that they'll do this, that very, at the time, at the current time, very unrewarding work of entering these foundations and doing this kind of work, and pulling the weeds out with the roots, dedicating their life to that. Maybe something will change, but the award is, in general, the award, I'm not a big fan of the award, and or the competition, to be honest, which is very anti-Hellenic of me, unfortunately. But um, I feel like it incentivizes, writing for profit. Because some of these foundations give out very big rewards. I believe there's one that gives out $250,000. I
Oh,
can't recall which one.
oh,
There's one that gives out $250,000 to a poetry winner, and this just incentivizes essentially studying the foundation, seeing their track record, and trying to synthesize all everything that they've hailed before, synthesize that into a perfect contest winner, which at that point doesn't really isn't really authentic anymore. So competitions too, I don't really like writing competitions, even though I participate in them, and I, I'm not sour about not winning, and I don't like to brag about winning either. But I still, there's this feeling of, I'm writing for a purpose that isn't really true to the authentic origin.
I get you. It's this is a personal peccadillo of mine more than an actual need, we'll say. It's just it feels like there's nothing to perfect myself for. I may spend 100 hours on a novel, or more, and then I publish it. No, even if I advertise it, no one may care, and it's like I can't even send it in to fight other things, and so perhaps gain a little bit of immortal glory from winning a contest. But you're correct on it. People do write these things for the contest. It's not like I've not considered it, in my younger years, and it's how do I want to put it? It's maybe it's because I saw the Hugos decline, in the science fiction field,
Yeah.
and devolve into an unusable morass of corruption and despair, that I wish for this, because I do think that they provide a service where those who are elite can look and curate their choices. By way of a metaphor or analogy or whatever, Barack Obama was famous for buying books, and I don't think he ever read them. But what would happen is that author would be catapulted to a certain amount of fame. And for example, he bought these books about the Ozarks. And don't you know, in the Ozarks, the fathers are abusing the daughters, and all this other stuff, which I want to be very clear. As a man who lives in Missouri, they are not doing that. It was entirely calumny, lies, and slander. Um, but he famously went into a bookstore, picked up these books, had him under his arm when he went to whatever vacation he was taking at the day, and he took many vacations. And so I, as a college student who took a minor in creative writing for some awful reason, I was mad, I tell you, driven mad by the maenads. We had to go and listen to this woman talk about things I knew were false in the Ozarks themselves, which again I'll repeat, or she wrote
Yes.
complete slander across 3 novels. So there's a use for it in the circulation of elites and the reinforcement of elite preferences, but at the same time, it's like it just leads to corruption, as you've said.
Yes. Ideally, as I've said, ideally, I think the way this would be achieved is just people with very, so excellent that even the elites cannot avoid purchasing their work and checking it out. I really think it's uh, perhaps misunderstood by some people how great you have to be right now with the history that we have, with the background and the foundation that we have. It's not a, you can be a very, very good poet, but if you really, really see yourself at the top of the throne and making a lasting impression, you have to be excellent. You have to be absolutely excellent. And I don't use this word lightly. It has to be full excellence and perfection right now. And at least you have to strive for it. I don't know. I'm sure. I'm sure there's a great amount of kids now who are writing great things, and they have. I know. I personally know people who write very well, and they don't really share their work, or they're still working on their craft. But the question is, are all of us these kinds of people, like uh, we might be setting the stones for, but we ourselves won't be remembered. And that's once again a question that has to be asked at all times. If you
Hmm.
know if you're willing to give, knowing that you might not get whatsoever. It's what I mentioned to you before we started the stream, this eternal question of whatever you want to do, can you imagine yourself doing it in a blank room without an audience for the rest of your
Absolutely.
life and getting pleasure out of it? If the answer is yes, then you're a blessed individual, and you have to seize this, seize on this instinct, and carry it forward. If But you might also have to face a very painful truth that perhaps it's not for you.
I absolutely agree, and
This
I'm
is this
producing.
is a yeah. This is a sorry to interrupt you. Just final thought. Um, a final thought that I've actually forgotten. So so go ahead.
I'm sure it'll come back to you.
Yeah.
And I talk about these things just because it's part of a greater organic system that seems to rise up naturally. That I feel is part of it, because I've followed many different thinkers, I've read many different books. I understand that the population means nothing, but at the same time, where do the elites get their power? From the mobs of regular people, and other things like that. And just because it's bad right now, it won't be bad later. And I absolutely agree with you when you said that we're doing things that we may be forgotten for. This may come as a shock to people in my circles who are very avid readers, very well educated, but George MacDonald is forgotten in general life. C.S.
Yes.
Lewis is remembered, of course, for his books, and Tolkien is remembered, even though they are attempting to damn the memory with every ounce of hellfire in their cold, dead hearts that they have. It is an infernal portal that pours out the hellfire. The there's these, but like there are generations of men, great writers. Dunsany is another big one, who are largely forgotten. The common people would not know who you're talking about. Algernon Blackwood, Dunsany, MacDonald, Algernon Blackwood. There's a whole lot. Nathan Hawthorne's son, Nathaniel Hawthorne's son, excuse me. Pardon me while I turn around to my library. And that doesn't even mention the amount of theologians, hymn writers, all who are all parts of an American tradition. Like, you'd be shocked how much American literary tradition is tied up into hymns. Um, Excuse me. Paul Anderson's being forgotten, even though things like Appendix N are trying to bring him up with Jeffro Johnson. I spoke as Mark Anthony at his canceling today. He was mean to a woman online, you see, and I came not to avenge Jeffro, but to bury him. Um, Zelazny is being forgotten. He wrote the Chronicles of Amber, which was a very important piece of science fiction for people who grew up in the 80s and the 70s. Olaf Stapledon is being forgotten. I'm a big science fiction writer, so these are all just science fiction guys so far. Like David Halquist wrote some of the best science fiction of our current time, and he even got into the top 50 books on Amazon for more than an hour, and still it's like no cultural impact. It's like I absolutely
Yes.
accept that I might be forgotten, but the point is, for me, as a I wouldn't call myself a true vitalist, but as a man who believes in a mission from God, there is a point to fighting on in the dark and to make sure that whatever great men trod on our bones, that they are very comfortable bones indeed, and they do not curse that their forefathers were as wicked as their forefathers, the baby boomers, who would burn a book of poetry for the warmth. So to me that's very inspiring. It's hate, for this system, hate for the things that are destroying the things that should have been my inheritance and my love. But at the same time, it's to love the future and to bring it closer and to be pleasing to God with my actions, hoping for that future rather than hating the future and hating the past and being nothing but a miserable coal to be burned
Yes.
and forgotten.
Yes.
That is my final word. But have you remembered, sir, your final word?
I have not. I have
With
not, and I believe this is a sign for us to wrap up, because my mind is starting to drift.
It's no problem, sir. Any more,
We've
and I
been
will.
we've been we've been going a good hour and a half. I'm
Yeah.
impressed. Nice.
Edmund, this has
If
been
I,
fantastic. I want to
thank you very much for having me. I apologize for rambling and going off topic every now and then, but
Oh no,
it's been excellent.
this is very on brand. This is exactly what I wanted. You've been an excellent guest, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you for hosting me.
And we're done. Uh,
Yes.